Hey everyone, welcome to this demo on using After Effects and kind of just dabbling in it and kind of figuring things out. We're going to go ahead and go over probably mostly the interface of After Effects. I'll also show you how to create a comp, what a timeline is, how to import files, how to export files, things like that. I do have this PDF of this motion graphics handout that is in Canvas, so you can go and look at that at your convenience. But it kind of has everything I'm going to be talking about in here as well. So just something for you to kind of look at. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is that I'm going to create a project folder. So anytime I want to create some sort of After Effects file, I'm going to create a project folder that I'm going to keep all my files in, just because it makes things much easier, especially if you're saving files all over the place and you accidentally lose one, then you're in trouble because it won't link to the working file. So, excuse me, just make sure you have a project folder created. One other thing I want to mention before you make the project folder is when you're creating your digitized file, so going from sketch format into a digital format, whether that's in Illustrator, Procreate, Photoshop, any of those will work. But just make sure that when you're illustrating that all your elements are on separate layers, just because if you keep them all in the same layer and try to export it, then you're stuck and it's hard to kind of unpiece everything to get certain things to move. So I always like to separate everything on its own layer. Just makes it much easier, I promise. And we can always kind of condense files as we continue working on stuff in After Effects. So make sure that you have separate layers for your files. I like to name all my layers just because it makes things a lot easier, especially when you're moving files into After Effects. You're going to have a lot of layers in your panel and it's going to get really overwhelming. So keeping those nice and organized and named and clean is going to make a much more smoother workflow for you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make my project folder. So I'm on a Mac computer here, but this is pretty much the same for PC. There might be a few different hotkeys and things like that that you can use. I also have hotkeys, handouts listed in Canvas as well for you. So I'm going to go to my desktop and say, for example, I want to make a project folder. I'm going to click Control or left click Control basically and create a new folder on my desktop. When I go to make files and make my project folder, I like to save it in more than just one place. Only because if you were to lose your files, your computer crashes one day and you lose everything, then you're kind of screwed. So anytime you work on a or After Effects file or a digitized file, I like to just copy and paste it into several other storage devices. So I use my desktop, I save it on a hard drive of some sort, and then I also save it in a cloud folder. That way you just have it in multiple places to make it much easier for you. So I went ahead and made this folder here, and I'm just going to title this, you can title this whatever you want, probably what your project name will be. I'm just going to call it Motion Basics in Illustration. It might be a good practice actually to put your name on this. I'm going to go back and put J. Kolpakov _ Motion Basics and Illustration. So I got my project folder created here. This is kind of when you autosave, everything's going to go into this folder. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and launch After Effects. So I do have it pulled up here. This window will most likely pop up for you, depending on what screen you're working on. It may be a little bit different, but you're going to see here on the left hand side there is a new project button and an open project button. Open project button would be if you were already creating a file and you saved it and you want to come back to it, you can just open it from there. Pretty straightforward. If I want to make a new project though, I'm going to go ahead and click this button, and it actually got minimized. I apologize. So it's going to pull up this sort of workspace here, and there's a lot of things that are going on here, but I'll take some time and kind of walk through these here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click on New Composition. That's just the one I always go with here whenever I am, making a file. And it's going to pop up this window here, which is basically comp settings. There's different things we'll need to kind of put in here. So composition name, I'm just going to name this the same thing as my project folder. So J. Kolpakov _ Motion Basics and Illustration. since that's the class this is for. And then for preset, I'm going to leave it on custom. You can go through and play with these and change things if you want, but I just like to use custom because I'm going to go in and change things anyway after I do this. I don't really mess with the advanced or 3D renderer tabs. I mean, if you kind of understand these a little bit better, definitely by all means you can use them. I don't think it's necessary, so I don't really do anything with those. And then we're going to look at our size. So one thing I like to stress with students is to make sure that your digital file that you're creating your illustration in is the exact same size as your After Effects workspace file or your comp file. And this is because if it's a different size and you try to drag it into After Effects, it's going to shrink really small, or it's going to do some wonky things. And then you're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to resize everything essentially. So just to make it easier, make sure your digital file is the same size. I like to do 1080 by 1080. That's kind of a square format that you can use for like Instagram or other social media. If you want to do something more rectangular, I would recommend doing 1080 by 1920, just because again, you're kind of keeping in that ratio somewhat. But you can always scale it down to 720 by 720. It's definitely doable. It'll just be a smaller file. Sometimes 1080 can be a little bit big for some computers or processors. But we can always, again, go back and size it down a little bit more later on if you feel like it's necessary. But again, bigger files, I think they're better. You can kind of use them if you want to do these screenings or show them in kind of a larger format. And there's also this lock aspect ratio, and this is just basically if I were to go change this to 1920 by 1920, it would go in and kind of change this ratio for me. So let me go ahead and pull this back up here. Going back to what we were at, looking at sizes. So again, lock aspect ratio, you can just check it. Basically, if I just change stuff like 1080 by 1080, it'll just be the same width versus height. If you have it as a different ratio, maybe 1920 by 1080, and I want to lock this and change this, it'll change that in a perfectly proportional sort of manner. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this as 1080 by 1080. And then for the pixel aspect ratio, I like to leave it on square pixels. That's just kind of the standard. I don't really know much about these other ones, to be honest, but this is pretty much the norm. Your frame rate is basically just how many frames per second that the animation is working. And I like to leave, this is kind of the standard. So it pops up as 29.97. But for our case, we can go ahead and do 23.975. Really, if you do in between those, I think it's fine. You could do 23 something, you could do 29 something. But 23.975 is pretty standard. So, and leave this frames per second checked here. Drop frame, I wouldn't really mess with that too much. So you can leave that as is. As far as the resolution, always leaving this on full. That's just going to be your fullest max size that you created with the width and the height. You can see on the right hand side here, when I go to change this, say if I go to half, it's going to cut that measurements in half and make my file smaller. You can do a third, quarter, but just leaving it on full. That way it's not going to mess with your resolution. Your time code is basically just when the animation starts. So you can just leave that as 0 because we want it to start from 0 and go to a certain number. And the duration of your animation is basically the amount of time that the piece is animating. So here it already presets it to 5. I'm just going to go in and put in 7 just because it'll just give me a little bit extra time to kind of really do what I want here. Background color, you can just leave that black. If you really want it to be white, you can. Maybe I'll just change it white for fun. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And it's going to go ahead and bring up my screen here. So it's going to pull up this whole workspace for me to kind of dabble in. If you want to look at this at different settings, you can look at this at a 400%, super zoomed in, 6.25%. I just like to do fit just so it's, at the size and I don't see any weird cropping going on. This is that resolution again, like I just mentioned, so just leaving that on auto is important, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then going into the workspace here, so there's a few different things I'll kind of pull out about the interface of this workspace. We have our toolbar at the top here, if you're familiar with Adobe Photoshop or Illustrator, this is kind of similar to that. You can play around with it. We have our type tool, you can just hold down and see the different type mechanisms. There's pen tool. We have our shape tool, eraser tool, clone stamp tool, brush tool, puppet position pin tool. So that's kind of like more of a puppet warping sort of thing. We have our hand tool. So if you just click that, you can drag your board around. This is just your selection tool. That's kind of standard. So I like to leave it on that just so I don't accidentally click on something that I'm not supposed to, basically. So that's our toolbar. We will have our project panel here on the left side. So this is kind of where your files will be stored. So our comp is already existing here. And I'm going to go ahead and when I import files, they're going to pop up in this this sort of project panel here. One thing I want to stress as well is to always Command S and save your file, even if you haven't done much yet, but just constantly saving your files over and over again, just so you don't lose any data in case if something were to crash and you lose files. So I'm going to go to my desktop here, and I'm going to save that in my project folder. Your After Effects file is going to be an AEP file. So I'm just going to go in and name it the same thing as my project folder. So Motion Basics and Illustration. And I'm going to click Save. So this is saved in my project folder on my desktop now. So we have it saved. That's great. Some other things to look at is the timeline. So this is your timeline down here. Basically, this is where you can put your composition layers into there, and you can kind of manipulate when things move at certain times. So it's kind of like a time stamping mechanism. I'll kind of walk through that a little bit more here soon. That'll make a little bit more sense. But you will be able to play with transform options, expressions, adding key points, which is kind of what those stamps are, and playing with keyframes in the timeline, and stuff like that, basically. And then over here we have our sort of composition kind of workspace, or this is your workspace here. So this is basically the file that you're going to be looking at and watching things animate. So this is kind of just like the actual physical preview of what you're doing. We have this section over here that's part of that timeline that's going to have all your layers listed in there. So when we drag files into there, your layers are going to pop up just like they would in Illustrator or Photoshop or even Procreate, and they'll be kind of easy to look at there. Again, making sure your layers are all named, it's going to make stuff much easier, just for more organization and stuff like that. And then we have our grouped utility panels, which is basically all this extra jargon on the right-hand side. Really the only ones I use would be if I was to make something with the type tool. There's a characters window that you can play with different fonts and things like that. There's also this effects and presets panel that you can go in and add some pre-made sort of animations to your design. And I'll show you how this works in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do one quick thing about making your own shapes or vectors in After Effects and how you can kind of move those. But this is kind of applicable to any files you decide to import into After Effects. So I'm going to go ahead and add, I'm just going to play around and do a type tool here. I'm just going to type in my name with this really ugly font. That's great. Let's go ahead and change the color of this. So let's make it, I don't know, like a fun pink color. Or maybe I'll do it like a red. I like the red. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I have my name built in here. Again, this is just like like Illustrator, so it's going to make it a vector sort of file on its own. So I got my name put here. Maybe I want to put something in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and build, let's just do like a star tool. Hold shift and pull that big. Let's drag it in here. Maybe I want it a little bit smaller. And I'm going to put this in the background here. And let's change this color to a nice like peachy pink. Oh, maybe not. I got to do it in the fill up here. Peachy pink. Make a little more pink. Okay. So I have my star and I have my name. We can see here that the star is in front of the name and we don't want that. We want to see the name in front. So this is basically the same as using any other Adobe file or program. You're basically just going to move the shape layer underneath your name, and it's going to throw it behind there. So whenever you're importing your layers, you should have your layers already arranged accordingly in your other program, but if not, you can just go and redrag them and move them around here, basically. Okay, so I got my name, got my star, and I just want to dabble with a few things here in this timeline area. I know your first exercise, you're going to be playing with expressions and with transforming tools and options. I do have a tutorial on some expressions you can play around with on Canvas, so you can go and look at those. But for the transforming things, they're fairly simple. So I'm going to click on my layer that I want to manipulate. If you look over here on the left-hand side, this eyeball is basically a toggle that will make stuff invisible. It'll still be in the working file, but I can just turn it off or turn it back on. I can lock a layer. If I click this little box underneath, that means I can't really move it. In case if I want to animate something else and I want that to stay where it's at. There's different other things you can do here. But I'm going to click this little caret here on the side, and it's going to do kind of sort of a drop-down thing. If I do text, I can do a few different options here, but I don't really mess with these too much. But I'll go into transform. So transform is the thing that you want to open up, because there's these different sort of things that you can play around with them in here. So we have our anchor point, we have positioning, we have scale, we have rotation, and we have opacity. So these are kind of the very simple transform options that we can play with. And they're kind of a good way just to kind of dabble in and start to understand how things are moving. So we can see here when we drop this caret down, there's these little kind of stopwatch or clock icons that are next to each of these transforming tools. And these are basically key points or keyframes, or a timestamp is what I like to call them. But when I click them, so for example, maybe I want to make something pan across the screen or move across the screen. So if I click this, it's going to automatically signal my animation that it's going to start doing something, basically. So you want it to check at that 0 timeline, at 0 seconds, so it knows that when you go to change it somewhere else down the road, this kind of value here, it's going to move to that position. But I want this to pan across the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this keyframe. And I'm going to position this where I want it to start at. So we can see here these two numerical sort of formulas. The one on the left is kind of how it moves left to right or right to left. And the other one is how it moves up or down. So I'm going to go ahead and just click it and drag it to the location I want it to be at. So I'm going to keep dragging it, and I'm not just clicking it and dragging it with my mouse. You can do that, but if you want it to be a nice straight line, you can just drag this number, and it's going to stay in a perfect consistent line. So I wanted to start at this number here. So I'm going to go ahead and click my stopwatch, and it's going to signal that this is where my name is going to start. And then here we have our frames per second. You can see them kind of timed out. In our timeline, we see that 7 seconds is as long as this animation can go, because in our comp settings, that's what we made it. We made the duration 7 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and just toggle this little line here, and I have to move it to a certain point that I want my animation to end at. So I'm going to go all the way, let's go all the way to, let's just do halfway for now and see how this looks. I'll do it like about here. So I want my animation to get to the other side of the composition at 3.12 frames per second, or frames, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and move my formula again, or my number, and move it all the way over to the other side. And you'll see that there's this kind of dragging sort of line. This is just showing kind of that path that it's moving on. So I'm going to have it go all the way to this point. And it already created a keyframe for me. So I didn't have to click any stopwatch. Once I change that number, it's going to automatically put a keyframe in my timeline for me. So if I go back and I rewind this to here, or even if I drag it, we can see that it's moving. And if I go back to the beginning and I just hold spacebar, we can watch it move in real time. So it's going to move to the other side and then it's going to stop. It's not going to do anything else. So maybe I wanted to move back the other way. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this, and I'm going to go ahead and actually maybe I want this to go back and forth 2 times. So I'm going to drag this keyframe and move it to maybe 2 seconds. And instead of going to maybe 4 keyframes and figuring out what this value is and retype it in, I can just copy and paste these keyframes. So I'm going to hold shift and click both of these keyframes. On Mac, it'll be Command C just to copy it. And I'm going to move my my little timeline to the point that I want to paste these keyframes. So if I go in and I click Command V, it's just going to add those keyframes in there for me. So if I go back to the beginning, we can see that it's going to bounce back and forth. So pretty cool, right? Pretty simple. So we can see that. So that's kind of one thing that's really easy. Maybe I want to play with the name rotating. Maybe it's kind of going back and forth as it's moving throughout the comp. So maybe about halfway between it shifting, so dead center, I'm going to click this rotate stopwatch, and I'm just going to play with the rotation. So maybe I'm going to go to here, and I'm just going to put in -23 instead. I'm going to go to here, put in 23, and then maybe here. I guess it kind of ends, so I won't worry about that. Again, always make sure you save your files. You're saving your working file all the time. I'm just going to watch through this again. We'll see it kind of moving. See how it's kind of bouncing back and forth. I can make it do it a lot quicker. You know, maybe I want this to bounce back and forth like really fast, so I can just drag these around, and the closer the keyframes are together, the quicker the animation will work. So I can just copy these, maybe go to here, paste them, just kind of paste them down my timeline. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one, paste this one, stuff like that. So if I go back, again, Command S, go watch it, it's going to bounce a lot more quicker throughout the animation. And this is going to constantly loop through your preview, so you'll see how it kind of, you know, works back and forth. So yeah, pretty easy. Okay, maybe I want to play with the shape now, and you know, maybe make the star kind of blink or kind of change the opacity of it. I'm going to go ahead and rename my layer. Again, always naming your layers is important. Dragging down this transform tool, exact same things again, but we're going to play with the opacity. So I'm going to start with it at 100% on 0. That's the most opaque I want the star to appear. But I'm just going to drag this around and just play with a bunch of different sort of values. Let's see, we'll go down to 10. And doing this kind of more randomly is going to make it look a little bit more realistic, like it's a real star kind of, you know, blinking. Let's see, we'll do 45. Go back to 100. Let's go to here, maybe do 20. 75. And maybe I just want to copy a couple keyframes so I don't have to go back and do this. Okay. Command S. We're going to go back and watch this again. So see how it's kind of blinking, doing different things. Pretty fun stuff. And see how that star kind of has an awkward transition at the very end. It just goes, watch it right here. It kind of just instantly goes to 100%. There's a way we can loop this that makes it a lot easier and more smooth. There is an expression, a looping expression that you can throw in here instead that can also do this. But I like to do it manually if I can, just because it's easy. So basically what you want to do is to make sure that the star, the number that you start with at 0 is the exact same number that you end with. So I started at 100%. And I want this to end at the very end. If I drag this, see how it ends at 75? Let's put in 100 here. Again, we're going to save, go back, and let's see how this works if it's a little bit more smooth. So let's watch through this. See how that's a lot more smooth? So that's kind of an easy way you can loop this and make it feel more like a GIF sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're going for. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this, click spacebar. So that's kind of how all these transforming tools work. You can always just go in and play with them. You know, maybe you want to play with the star getting big. Let's see. Let's try to get it to here, and then maybe it'll shrink back down to here. So just kind of a fun sort of thing. And again, it's kind of jumping. So whatever number I start, maybe I want to start this at, maybe this value here. I'm just going to copy this, or maybe copy this keyframe, bring it to the end, paste it, and we can see that there's a bunch of these little dots appearing. That's what we're wanting. That's all of our keyframes, all these different things that are moving. So now it's going to have a lot more of a seamless animation happening here. See how it kind of didn't jump? So that's kind of what we're going for. So that's basic transform controls. There's a few other things you can play with as well. One thing I like to play with is these effects and presets here. These are just kind of pre-made animations you can just apply to your layer, and it automatically does it for you. You can access them either on the right side here, or if I click the layer I want and go to effect, they will also pop up here. I really only use distort most of the time. There is some other ones that you can use as well, but this is really the one that I'm more comfortable using. So like CC Bendit, if you wanted to make leaves kind of like, blow in the wind, that's a good one to use. You can use Liquify if you want stuff to be a little more fluid. You can use the warp tool, wave warp. I like wave warp tool, things like that. So you can click it and it'll automatically add it to your layer. If I just want to apply it myself, if I type in wave warp in the search bar, it'll pop up, and I'm just going to drag that on my star. Go ahead and Command S, and it's already going to start applying it right away, so we can see it happening here. So if I click play, we'll see how it's kind of moving in this weird wavy kind of fashion. I can mess with this differently. Maybe I want to change the kind of edges of these waves, so maybe I want it to be more jagged. I can also play with different heights, if I want the waves to be taller or shorter, or if I want them to kind of last longer throughout, so changing the width. So let's go ahead and just play with these. Maybe I'm going to do 50. See how jagged it gets there. And then the width, maybe I'm going to lower it to 10. See how weird that is? It's really wonky. I can also change the direction of them. I can either put in a number here or just play with this little clock here. See how weird it gets? And see how it's kind of slowing down? It just needs time to load through the animation. So just let it preview, and then it'll work very smoothly. And there's also different speeds if you want to do something really crazy, get it really going. You can also play with that as well. I'm going to Command S this. If I don't want this effect anymore, say I put it on here and I'm like, this looks hideous, like I don't want this on here. You can easily just delete effects. If you just drop down the effects panel under your star and just delete it, it'll go right away, and then you'll be back to your normal sort of thing here. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to import a file into After Effects pretty easily. There's a few different ways you can do this, but I'll just show you the way that I always do it. Before I do that, I just want to make sure, if I go back to my projects folder, that I put my Illustrator or Photoshop file in this project folder. So if I click here, we can see it. There it is. One thing to think about and make sure when you're going to make these files is that it's in RGB format. If you have it in CMYK, I can't quite figure out why it won't really work in After Effects. It just flattens the file automatically. But you should be able to make it in RGB by changing the color profile in Procreate, Illustrator, Photoshop, whatever program you're using. It should be pretty simple. So just making sure this is in RGB before you bring it into After Effects. So we have it in here. I can either go up to here and click File, Import, and then click File. I could also just drag this in to After Effects if I wanted to, and it will also give me the same prompts. But I'm just going to go in and import it just so you could see this. It's just one file, so we just click File. I'll go ahead and highlight it. and it'll show here as import as. I'm just going to click it to retain layer sizes just so it stays the exact same size and everything like that. So as we can see here, we have it set in that. If I click it, it'll say it again, retain layer sizes, and I want to leave it at editable layer styles. And this is just so that it doesn't flatten the file. I can go in and edit each layer. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So we can see up here its size and everything. Here's a comp that it makes, and then we can see our actual layers here. See how they're all named here. So if I just double click this, it's going to automatically throw all my layers into the project panel and timeline. So we can see here all of our files. If I go in and just mess with the different ones, you can make them invisible, you can lock them, things like that. So that's how you can import your files, but just double clicking composition, it's going to make it all nice and neat. If I go in and I drag my layers into this, so let's go ahead and try this again. So I'm going to click this, retain layer sizes, editable layer styles. If I drag my layers folder into here, it's going to get all wonky. So it's going to try to use a dimension from some other element in my Photoshop file, and we're going to get this kind of chaotic mess. So the important thing is to make sure you just double click that actual comp, because that's going to make it much smoother and make sure everything's in the same size here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy or command save this so I have it. But we have basically all the same things that we can do, you know, as we can do with what we did with our other animation that we did. If I wanted to, for example, play with this again, throw a wave warp onto my zigzag in the background here, it's going to pop it up, and then we can see how it's moving here. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with your file. Again, it's all about how much you want to learn, how much you want to put into this, but it's pretty open-ended. There's no really right or wrong way to go about this. So that's how you would save it. Just make sure, again, the working file is in your projects folder. If I wanted to go in and edit my Photoshop file, let's see if this will work without my computer crashing. So I can go in and edit the Photoshop file. Say if I want, I don't know, I want this square in here for some reason. We'll change the color. Let's move it up to the top here. Say I want this square here for some reason. If I just click Command S, exit out of it, it should put that square back in here, and I guess it did not. Maybe I would have to re-import it. Usually it'll save it and update it. Maybe I need to exit out of here, so maybe it didn't work. I apologize about that, but you should be able to update your Photoshop file and it should translate back over. I might just have some setting that's clicked off of here. But anyway, so I have my thing here, and maybe I'm finished with it and I want to export my file when it's finished. And I typically like for you guys to export an MOV file and to also make a GIF. The GIF is pretty easy to do in Photoshop. The MOV will just do straight from here. So I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to export, and I'm basically going to just add this to the render queue. So not Adobe Media. That's going to pull up on a whole nother program that's kind of a pain in the butt. This is going to do it right inside of After Effects. So we're going to get this other sort of window that pops up in our timeline. I can go back and toggle through these. They're kind of like little browser windows. So if I want to go back and change things, if not, I can go to my render queue. And I'm just going to change a couple sort of settings. So excuse me, the render settings, you know, you just want to double check that it's on best and full resolution. You can click OK for that. And then as far as the output goes to, that's where you want to save your file. So I like, again, to save it in my projects folder. We're going to click Save. It's saved as an MOV file. If you can't get it to save as an MP4, no problem. We can drag it into Photoshop and convert it that way as well. So we have it in here as our output, our high quality. As we can see, we have our RGB, format QuickTime. Let's see what happens if I click something like this. Oh, okay, cool. So this will actually change it to MP4, and that's what we want. So it was basically set on QuickTime, which we don't want. That's the MOV. We want to switch it to MP4. So just doing this H.264, that's a pretty standard video file. In here, when you go to your output mode settings, so click OK, and this is, yeah, exactly what we want. We want an MP4 file, not an MOV, so I apologize about that. So we went ahead and we got that saved, so we can go ahead and click render. So this should go ahead and export my file. So let's see what happens here if my computer doesn't crash. All right, so we got that saved. So let's go ahead and see if it worked. So let's go back to our projects folder. We're gonna go here and we're gonna click this and we can see it moving. So that's pretty much how you export an MP4 file. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty nice large file here. Say if I want to convert this to a GIF to save, we're going to switch this into, I'm just going to save this again. We're going to switch to Photoshop and play with it that way. So let's go ahead and, let me see, it's probably going to be a little bit slow here. So just wait 1 second. All right, so we're going to go ahead and drag this into Photoshop and convert it to a GIF. So I'm going to take my MP4 file and drag it into Photoshop. And it should just pull it right in there. Again, this finished MP4 file that's in our projects folder. So let's see this here. Okay, so it's going to show up like this in your workspace, and it's going to be kind of similar to After Effects. If I just click play, it's going to do some wonkiness here. So pretty interesting stuff. So I'm going to go in, and when I want to convert or make it into a GIF, I'm going to go up to File. I'm going to go to Export, and under Export, we want to save it for the web. So just click on Save for Web. If your file is really big, sometimes it can get kind of slow here, so that's when we can kind of reduce its size whenever it's finished if we need to. Let's just see if this will open. My computer is a little slow, so. Alright, so we have it here pulled up. So this is the window that's going to pull up once you click Save for Web. And it's automatically going to have it set at GIF, so we'll go ahead and click that there. And then we're going to click on, I probably won't do any preset, I'll just leave it unnamed. You typically want to leave it at the most amount of colors so you don't lose any resolution. Making sure it's in RGB format. Again, it can convert it for you if it's not. Keeping its size. This is where if we wanted to make it a smaller size, maybe I want to make it 720 by 720. It's going to make it at 40% of the actual size. And another thing is making sure it loops, so doing looping options forever. And then we're going to click Save. And again, with the image size, you can leave it at 1080. If you want to reduce it to 720, that's fine too. I had it at 1800 for some reason, but a little bit smaller might be a little easier to export. So let's just give it another second while it thinks. Okay, so here is my window, Save As, and we're just going to save this again in our project folder. So we have it set as a GIF, keep it all the same here, click Save. So let's let it think again while it saves that file. And there we go. So let's go ahead and see if this worked. So I'm going to quit Photoshop. I'm going to say no save. I don't need that. Let's go ahead and open this here. And if you just hold it, there's our GIF. So yeah, that's basically it on kind of this rundown of After Effects. Again, a lot of it's just going to be kind of dabbling into it and kind of figuring things out. But if, one thing I like to tell students is to kind of think about what you want to animate before you actually animate it. So as you're drawing the illustration, think about what things do I want to move. That way we can make it for a more smoother workflow. We can set the files up to kind of do what we want them to do, and stuff like that, basically. So yeah, that's basically it. If you have any questions, just let me know. Hopefully this was helpful for you. But if not, yeah, good luck with the project.